In the beginning, the World Trade Organization seemed like a good idea. It was established on the 1st of January 1995, and the World Trade Organization sought to promote the concept of free trade through the reduction of barriers which might hinder or otherwise instill protectionist policies. Its trade forum, dispute settlement system, and wide membership meant that it was instrumental in the global reduction of trade barriers, such as tariffs, and the settlement of global disputes, as well as the creation of a predictable trading environment with the instigation of major and foundational principles of international economic law, including the most favoured nations standard and the national treatment standard. But the WTO now is essentially dead. Just like the League of Nations in the 1930s, the WTO, when faced with existential challenge to their very functioning, instead prove to be more or less useless. For the League of Nations back in the 1930s, this existential challenge was in preventing the outbreak of the Second World War and the German invasion of Poland. For the WTO, this was the prevention of trade wars under the Trump administration. It is in my belief that, in time, we may view the WTO in a similar way to that of the League of Nations. A relatively good idea, but fundamentally broken and unable to meet the challenge of a dictator being in command of a major global hegemon. But the collapse of the WTO did not take place overnight. It was the result of many years of undermining, as well as internal contradictions in its establishment. This episode, and the post of which I'm reading from, shall explore this in more detail, and explain why we can no longer think of the WTO as an existing institution. Finally, I will make a note about what this means for global trade going forward, and how we can potentially save some of the basic principles instilled in the legacy of this liberal approach to global trade. From the beginning then, the World Trade Organization was fraught with challenges. These challenges didn't necessarily appear immediately. These challenges were diametrically associated with the very institution that was so often called the jewel in the crown of the world trade system, its dispute settlement procedure. According to Bosch and Zook, they opine that, quote, the WTO has a remarkable system to settle disputes between its members concerning their rights and obligations under WTO agreements. This is certainly true. The Dispute Settlement Understanding, the DSU for short, created a system in which trade disputes could be heard and appealed at a rate far higher than any other international system for the settlement of disputes. The DSU, compared for example to the International Court of Justice or the International Criminal Court, is unmatched in terms of the number of disputes it was able to undergo. For example, between the 1st of January 1995 and the 1st of October 2016, a total of 566 disputes were brought before and to the WTO for WTO resolution. And so ultimately then, what we then see is that the dispute settlement system is one of the cornerstones of the world trade system. And one of the cornerstones of this particular dispute settlement system is the appellate body. These were able to hear appeals from the panel's stage and to adjudicate on the rights and obligations of the parties. The appellate body had consisted of 7 judges and were appointed for 4-year terms by the dispute settlement body, the DSB. There is a requirement of unanimity among WTO members when it comes to the appointment of new members. Herein lies the problem. The United States has consistently shown that they have a very selective approach to international law. A number of key international instruments, from the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, are either not signed or ratified by the United States. They remain distinct and hostile to the International Court of Justice since the Nicaragua case. They have also withdrawn from the ICJ's jurisdiction the so-called optional clause of Article 36.2 of the ICJ statute as the result of the Nicaragua case. The US were, however, seemingly on board with the World Trade Project. They engaged in the creation of the WTO and engaged in the dispute settlement system. This all changed, however, in 2016. Since that time, the United States has frequently blocked the appointment of new members to the appellate body, citing complaints such as judicial overreach, failing to adhere to the 90-day rule, a basic principle of the appellate body which stated that they would resolve disputes within 90 days of them being brought to that particular institution, and objections to the ways in which the dispute settlement system would interpret WTO rules, especially and particularly rules concerning subsidies and anti-dumping measures. The result is that by 2019, the appellate body had no longer the quorum of at least 3 members necessary to continue proceedings and therefore was dead. The appellate body crisis, as it became known, is the example of a great contradiction. The US is both the largest and most actively engaged state within international relations, while simultaneously most hostile to it, or one of the most hostile to it. This is this idea of a great contradiction that I'm sure I'll write about in more detail in the future. This also sets the stage for the moment that we are currently in. The Trump campaign made it very clear that if they were to win the 2024 presidential election, they would impose tariffs on a number of countries, including China, Canada, and Mexico. As such, the numerous executive orders doing exactly that should not have come as any kind of surprise to anybody. It is here that I believe the WTO died. A system that regulates world trade cannot function if the world's largest economy fails to follow the basic rules associated with that same world trade institution. Whereas, however, previous presidential administrations had opted for dismantling the World Trade Organization from the inside, contributing to the slow death of the institution, it was the Trump administration, both now and previously when they were in charge from 2017 to 2021, that have opted for a complete and total contravention of the most basic principles of WTO law. The result is less a slow erosion of international trade rules, which we have been seeing over the last few decades, but more a blatant destruction of the very purpose this institution was even established for. The result is that if the WTO fails to hold the United States in check, and it will show the rest of the world that trade agreements and principles which do not benefit them can just simply be ignored. It sets a precedent. The United States have set a standard for how other states can deal with the World Trade Organization rules, the specific rules that do not benefit them. The WTO on its own has failed, then. The project of trade liberalization and anti-protectionism is, in my opinion, no more. But the principles of the World Trade Organization are still knowable, and these principles even predate the World Trade Organization itself. For example, the most favored nation principle dates back centuries. And additionally, the dispute settlement system is something that predates the WTO and was originally established under the GATT trading system beginning in 1947. So these are not new rules. These are not new institutions necessarily. They have just been codified as part of the 1995 World Trade Organization project. The WTO, like any institution, only has power and influence so long as states in the international system are willing to engage and to accept that they have such power and influence. The US has shown clearly, as with many other areas of international law, that they do not accept the influence or power of the World Trade Organization. But other states can. A realignment appears to be taking place in a number of areas of global politics and international law. And it is for this reason why the study of international law and international relations right now is not only fascinating, but it is vitally important if we're going to maintain the basic principles of the liberal order that was built in the period following the end of the Second World War. What will emerge from such alignment is not predictable at this point. I can't tell you what's going to happen tomorrow, even the day after. I'm recording this episode on a day that we've seen the revealing of leaked information about internal military operations concerning the bombing of Yemen. One of the most unprecedented scoops in journalistic history. And it seems to be the case that the Trump administration doesn't really care. It doesn't really matter, according to them. Instead, it matters to nobody. And the result is that the entire world can see just how impactful this particular news story is. And instead of thinking internally, the Trump administration, Trump himself, has just instead attacked the journalists who reported on the story. The journalists who were part of that group chat. As the result of the incompetence of the administration, that journalist was able to get that scoop. The result is that attacking journalists, according to the Trump administration, is more important than attacking the internal incompetence of their own administration. We could be witnessing, and in my opinion, from the perspective that we are in right now, we are witnessing the slow collapse of the United States as a global hegemon. It might seem quite quick at the moment, but it might take years for this collapse to take place. The implications of such a collapse may be far wider reaching than simply that of the WTO. Now, that is a statement that I could probably qualify even stronger. It would be far wider reaching than that of simply the World Trade Organization. But fundamentally, what happens in the future, what happens in the next year, in the next 2 years, in the next 3 years, is something that we cannot predict. I didn't think, for example, that we would be seeing a Trump administration that was questioning the validity of presidential pardons because they were signed with AutoPen, rather than just being made at the behest of the Biden administration, and therefore believing that they were void and that they can go after these political opponents anyway in the first place. I didn't think that would happen. I didn't think that the United States would be deporting green card holding citizens for having views contrary to the Israeli state, for having radical Palestinian liberation views, but not being charged with any kind of offense, not being charged with any kind of crime. I didn't think that we would be seeing members of individuals who simply may have even been identified by a single tattoo, be deported to El Salvador and to be forced and sold into slavery by a dictator as the result of, again, loose or maybe even no connections at all to some kind of major Latin American gang. And all of this, by the way, in contravention of temporary restraining orders that had been issued by courts and by judges. None of this is normal. But what is important is that the principles that are enshrined in the WTO are still very important. They signal a world where international trade benefits a greater percentage of states and pushes towards a more equitable system of international relations. It is, of course, a system that is definitely not perfect and has been critiqued by a great many number of people. There are lots of critiques of the World Trade Organization. There are even lots of critiques of just the idea of liberal trading and trade liberalization more broadly in economic law. But it is better than the direction that it seems we're currently going. And it is so imperative that states work collectively to ensure that these principles, while not necessarily being relevant for the time being, and it is true, the World Trade Organization is no longer relevant, at least is not relevant for the time being, it's imperative that these states ensure that these principles remain understood for future generations, or if or when the world is ready for such a global economic institution to exist again.